All right, let's go ahead and kick this off. Hello, welcome to the second Society of Tolkien webinar. I'm your host, Keith Casey, and we're here to celebrate, to enjoy, to talk about the works of a great man, J.R.R. Tolkien. Specifically, we're going to see today how the world shaped him, how the things he was reading and learning and studying about and some of the experiences he went through shaped him in his writing, and how he used that to shape people, writers that are still writing today. So it's fascinating, some of the things we'll be talking about today. Before we dive into the agenda, I do need to give a bit of background. Originally, this effort was born out of the bizarre direction that the Tolkien Society took this summer. Instead of talking about Tolkien and his works, they turned themselves into this weird fan fiction group. To be honest, at first I was angry. I was frustrated. I was really disappointed in what they were becoming. And I wish them doom, I wish them failure, all those sorts of things. Not a great moment there. But then I realized I was on the wrong path. I realized I needed to change my perspective. Instead, I shifted my thinking. I gathered a fellowship. I gathered all of you. I gathered many of the people who joined us earlier this year. And we decided to create something better. So we decided to create something based in the good, the beautiful, and the true, instead of tearing down and destroying what was there before. So let me just tell you, trolls, be warned. You're not welcome here. This is not a place where we're going to deconstruct, decenter, decolonize, any of those things. That is not why we're here today. But to the men of the West, Shield Maidens and Shire folks, welcome. You are appreciated. You are loved. You are welcome. These are the people we want here. So please listen up, take notes, enjoy what our speakers have put together here for you today. It should be a really great time. And first up, not to take any more time from her, we have my good friend, Terena Bell. Terena and I have known each other for, I don't know how many years at this point, but we've run amok together, we've learned together, we've laughed together. So I'm looking forward to hearing what Terena has to share with us today, and hopefully all of you are too. So once again, I'll hand it off to you, Terena.
Thanks, Keith, and hi everybody else. I'm really glad that you are all joining with us today. This is the first time that I've done a conference presentation over Zoom, so I'm used to kind of interacting with the audience. I think that the way that Keith has got today formatted is that he's going to hold formal questions until the end, but please do feel free to go on and make comments. That's actually part of what I love so much about the one of these that we did in either June or July, was just the way that everybody kind of made friends and relaxed in our fandom and our love of Tolkien. And, we're kind of making comments and jokes with one another. So please feel free to do those. I personally won't be able to read them until the end. So if it's a question for me, I will read that and respond thereafter, or Keith will pose it at the end. But there are going to be a couple of places where I'm going to ask you what you think about things. So please feel free to go on and put that in the comments. So I'm going to hopefully get this to where you will now be able to share my screen, or see my screen rather. I'm the one that's sharing. And get these. And it looks like we're seeing everything. So if you'll bear with me, because again, this is my first time doing it this way.
We can see your screen. Now you muted yourself.
Okay, sorry about that. Thanks for bearing with me. I used to have a Windows which also had a touchscreen in addition to the keyboard, and I kept thinking, darn you, Apple, why can't I not just touch the mute button instead of having to pin over to it? But anyway, that's the glitch for the day. I apologize. So, what is a Hobbit? That is initially what Keith and I decided that I was going to talk about today, because I'm a writer. As a writer, I have always found it interesting that in a book called The Hobbit, that is about hobbits, that Tolkien waits actually until you're in the fourth paragraph to tell you what a hobbit is. So, if you're not going to tell me like right away, why even bother? Why not just let me kind of, like we do with a lot of science fiction and fantasy writing, just kind of learn what a hobbit is by attrition? Like, why even tell me if you're going to tell me after it's already started? So that's kind of where this session for today had originally come from. But whenever I started preparing, what I noticed, and we'll get more into this later, is that it's not so much what a hobbit is that matters, but it's these first 4 paragraphs. Like, there's a reason why Tolkien tells us what a hobbit is later. And it's because these first 4 paragraphs as a collective, they pretty much establish that a hobbit is life. A hobbit is everything that not only that book, but the Lord of the Rings trilogy takes into it. A hobbit is kind of the heartbeat of Middle Earth in its own little way. And these first 4 paragraphs set us up for everything that we are going to read and learn and explore and see and share and do, not just through the book The Hobbit, but through this entire Middle Earth world. So I kind of want to go through and do a little bit of an analysis together so we can see how Tolkien did this. So basically, this is, okay, sorry. Now it's not wanting to go to another slide. I apologize, gang. There we go. Okay. All right, so this is my mother's copy of The Hobbit. All right, I got so enthusiastic after our last session that we all did together that I immediately sat down and I started reading. This is the copy of The Hobbit that I grew up with. All right, the drawing is one of Tolkien's originals. It's a watercolor, and I know you can't see the whole cover because of the way that the slides and everything are done, but basically it's the one of Bilbo going up the river. So that's my mom's copy of The Hobbit. This is my copy of The Hobbit. So there's a little bit of a difference there. Now, the reason why I bring this up is just to show that there are multiple versions of The Hobbit. Like, there's US versus UK. When the second edition of The Hobbit came out, there was an author's note. Tolkien went back to a lot of his works and continued perfecting them, some of them even after publication. And he did that with The Hobbit as well. There are actually chapters later in the book where the story varies a little because he went back and made changes to The Hobbit after Lord of the Rings was published to help bring everything together in line, to make it all one cohesive story of the 4 books. So the reason why I mention that is because something that's important, something that has never changed, is the first sentence of The Hobbit. And it's an absolutely beautiful sentence. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. And we'll get into why it's so important that this has never changed and what this tells us about the world that he is creating here in a minute. But first off, I think it's important to know that I don't really read like a lot of other people. I read like a writer because I am a writer. Now, when something's horrible, you notice immediately, oh, this is really bad because that character doesn't seem real to me, or the dialogue's horrible. People would never say that. But when a book is really, really well written, as Tolkien's are, you get sucked into the world and you don't even realize sometimes that you're reading. You're just there and you're existing and you're breathing and you're going along on this wonderful adventure with them. And those are the books, that's the way that I want to write. That's the way that most writers want to write. We want to build worlds and create not characters, but people who live and are vibrant on a page. And so when I see that, when I'm sucked up in that moment, I go back and I think, how did they do that? So our question today is, with these first 4 paragraphs of The Hobbit that set up everything we need to know to get us ensconced and ready to be in this Middle-earth world, how did Tolkien do it? Well, he did it with intentionality. And yes, I know that this character is not in The Hobbit, but I put this character here for a reason. Who is this? And don't tell me Viggo Mortensen, all right? So in the comments, tell me the first name that comes to mind for this character. So I'm going to give us a little bit of a minute. Now, I'm willing to bet that some people think Aragorn, but I think Strider. And that's probably because of the way that he is named in the books. Like, he's in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, he's Strider first. And there's a reason that we don't know that he is Aragorn until later, because it's very important that his identity as the king be hidden. And so we've got Tolkien introducing something. We're talking today about how he introduces the hobbits. But when we look at Lord of the Rings, he introduces Strider or Aragorn as Strider because there is intentionality around his identity of the king and keeping that hidden. And so when somebody writes with something that strong, you see that characteristic in their writing across multiple books. So when we look at the way that Tolkien introduces a hobbit, maybe it doesn't sound important that he waits until the fourth paragraph to tell us what that is. Maybe that's why some of us might have been bored in high school English because of stuff like that. But when you think about the fact that he is intentionally holding information and revealing it in the order that we need it to be in that world and to revel in the story, not just within one book, but as a technique that he uses across all of his writing, it helps us to maybe understand, why the way these little hobbits are presented to the world matters. So let's go back to that first sentence. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. What does this tell us? All right, so let's look at it together. We know that hobbits, or at least this particular hobbit, lives in a hole, right? So they've got to be small. That's not a cave in the ground. It's a hole, okay? All right, we know that this hole is in the ground. It's not a hole like in the side of somebody else's house. Like if anybody's read The Borrowers, by Mary Norton, like they live in holes that are in the side of humans' houses. Okay, but hobbits live in holes that are in the ground. So hobbits are ensconced and integrated with their environment, all right? And then something to me as a writer that picks out when I read this, there's not a comma. So like your English teacher would make you write, in a hole in the ground, comma, there lived a hobbit. But what punctuation does is it makes the reader stop, and it's a pause, okay? So there is not a pause here. It's just straight up, in a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. And that, to me, the fact that there's no hole between, no comma or no pause between the environment that a hobbit lives in and who the hobbit is, that to me says a lot about a hobbit's place in the world. A hobbit is part of the world. They are integrated. Which, when you go on and you look at the rest of this paragraph, okay, and we'll get back to that integration later. He comes back to it in the second paragraph. But when we look at the rest of this, it all speaks to world building and to character. All right, so in a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty wet hole filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, not yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. So let's look at this together. We've got two different kinds of holes, right? We've got a comforter hole. That's where Bilbo is. But then we've got nasty, dirty, wet holes that are filled with worms. Who does that sound like? What character would prefer to live in a nasty, wet hole that has the ends of worms and smells, right? That's Smeagol or Gollum. So already, right off the bat, here in the first paragraph, in the second sentence, we introduce a second kind of hobbit. Because Gollum, you not want to spoil this for anybody, but probably most of us know that Gollum used to be a hobbit, okay? So when you look at that, it's interesting because not just have we got a compare and contrast of two different types of hobbits here, but we're even kind of introducing him a little. Like you look, like Gollum complained a lot. And what was one of the top things that he complained about? That there's nothing to eat, or that it was bad food, or it wasn't good food. And so here we are in this second sentence in not just The Hobbit as a novel, but the entire saga. And we've already kind of got the fact that Gollum exists being planted like a seed in our reader heads, with the language that he's using, all right? And it's funny because he hadn't even written all that yet, but it's just like a crop in a field. And some crops you plant them, and that summer you see what they are. That's corn, that's tobacco. But you think about a tree, and you think about how far back that tree has to be planted to then turn into something. And that's what this sentence does. It plants in our mind the whole character of Gollum, all right? So looking at that, and then there's also, going back to punctuation, there's also that colon there between sit down on or eat, and it was a hobbit hole. So we're taking a clean stop between who Smeagol is and who Bilbo is when we go back to Bilbo, because this particular story is his story. Right, so then we move on to the next paragraph, and I'm not going to read this whole thing, but I think that what's interesting here that we see is we're in community. So we start out with it being, just one little hobbit in a hole, who is Bilbo. And then we move to the fact that Gollum exists and that there are two kinds of hobbits in this world, all right? And that after that, we've got that there's a community. Like we're talking about, there are lots of pegs for hat and coat. He really loves having visitors. And then there's a hill, as people from many miles around called it. So we're learning now, just here in this second paragraph, that not only are hobbits integrated with their environmental world, but they're integrated with one another. Now, yes, the Shire is tucked back, so they're not integrated with the whole world. We're not looking at Gandalf here, who gets on his horse and is everybody's social friend, who has lots of pipe weed and love to have over for dinner, and then poof, he's gone until the next time he comes to eat. All right, that's not what hobbits are. But hobbits also do not live 100% away from themselves. And when we go back to that contrast, what kind of hobbit, when we've got two kinds of hobbit, what hobbit isn't in community? All right, we've got Bilbo, who he has visitors, all right? He's got prepared for his visitors. There are lots of chairs and pegs for them to put their coat. All right, so you've got hobbits that, yes, he lives in his hole, but he comes out of his hole at least enough to be with others of his kind and to be with others who live around him and to form and have some community. All right, he likes his time to himself, but he's also out there. He's a balance. But what kind of hobbit really just goes in his hole and stays by himself? It's Gollum in that nasty, wet, dirty hole with worms, okay? So Tolkien here is telling us that it's important for the good hobbit, the hobbit that's the main type of our story. When we go back to contrasting, he's not reclusing. And that's part of when you look at like him deciding whether to keep the ring, and Frodo, it's that decision of, am I going to separate myself from community, and am I going to separate myself from others? All right. So then we come down and we get to our next paragraph. All right. So we've got two types of hobbit, where they live, environment. Two, they are in community. The third thing that we learn about hobbits, and this is interesting, look at that very first sentence. This hobbit was a very well-to-do hobbit. It's about money. And that's kind of odd, right? Because they're in their environment. They're one with their community, but they also take time to themselves. But you see where people are calling them respectable, not only because most of them are rich, but money exists here. And that's really interesting because you see money separating them, like these kind of hobbits. And then when it goes on, like it talks about the Tooks and like how nasty they are, and like they come and they take all of their stuff while they're gone. So you've got like that as something that distinguishes hobbits from one another. And the reason why this is important, it's more important, I think, to Hobbit than to all of Lord of the Rings, although when you have Frodo grappling briefly with, do I keep this for myself, and all the power that it can contain, and then Sam, who's like this working class gardener, never really wanting it for himself, like that doesn't even pass into his mind, so the idea of money being introduced so soon, we do see that later in Lord of the Rings, but it's most important here in The Hobbit because after all, we're going and we're going after Smaug, we're getting the treasure back. And when you look at the fact that the first thing we're told about hobbits is that they're in community, they're loyal to one another, okay? And then you look at Bilbo has to inevitably make the decision of, does he give Oakenshield back the Arkenstone, or does he keep it for himself? Part of why we understand that it's not that Bilbo's just being a jerk, it's that after community, the next value that we learn about hobbits is that money does exist in their world, and that there are different social class levels. So it helps us to better understand why he might think initially about keeping that Arkenstone. And then you look at when he inevitably gave it up, it wasn't so much loyalty to the others in his party, but it was to help that other small community and that other town that needed the assistance of the trade, of them to fight for them in exchange for the Arkenstone. So we learn all these things before we finally get to what is a hobbit. And it's funny, you don't even think about it. Again, you're just reading, you're wrapped up in the story. But Tolkien writes with intentionality. And when he finally does go, well, what is a hobbit? Well, I suppose hobbits need no description nowadays. It's in the middle of the story. Like he's talking about how some of the hobbits have wealth, and then he goes, the mother of our particular hobbit, what is a hobbit? It's an aside, it's like an extra. And that goes back and it reinforces that hobbits are integrated in the story from start to finish. And it reinforces the fact that they are integrated into Middle Earth as part of this larger community, that they live in integration with one another. And when he gets done, he just picks right back up the story. Like if we look at the end of this paragraph, he's telling us all these great things about the hobbits. They have deep, fruity laughs, and that they enjoy life. And then, as I was saying, the mother of this hobbit, and we are just right back to it. So again, I know that this is probably a lot of information and a bit of an intertextual analysis. It's probably hard if you're following along on Zoom instead of sitting there with your book in your hand. But my point is just to show that Tolkien gave us information in the order that he wanted us to have it. And hobbits are not to be underestimated. A lot of people kind of laugh when I say that The Hobbit's my favorite out of all 4 of the books, but it's hobbits matter. Hobbits are important. Little people count in the fight against the orcs, and you don't have to venture against all of Middle Earth, but you do have to be part of your shire, and the shire matters. And he tells us all of these things in such a beautiful order, because the reality of it is he's creating this huge, vast world full of real people on a page that are grappling with universal themes. Things that are just so huge that one hobbit cannot take it all alone. But when you look at the reality of it, all of this story starts within a hole in the ground. There lived a hobbit. And so it's like, yes, there's this big, huge world that he's creating that it takes, I hate to say prequel because he wrote The Hobbit first, but it takes a solo book and then a trilogy to tell. And then it even leaves us wanting more movies and television shows and all of these things. But this story begins in a single hole with a single hobbit, because each and every individual, no matter how small, matters. And I could go on, but we're supposed to have 15 minutes. I'm probably over it. We've got other presenters today, and I'm sure Keith is ready to get in there and go for it. So that's the end of the official Terena presentation part. Thank you for caring.
Terena, thank you. That was fantastic. I love the aspect that it starts from something so small, and that even the smallest person, the smallest voice, the smallest participant can have radical impact on everything else. That's fantastic. And the fact that it all community is in what, the second, third sentence. That's fantastic.
Second paragraph. Yep.
Yeah, I love how that. I had never considered that he's introducing all those concepts at the very beginning. So thank you for that. So I'm going to switch you to. I'm going to turn your camera off and introduce Juliet Sneed on our side. Hello, good morning, Juliet. All right, you are muted. Let me ask to unmute you so that you're all set there. All right. Can you go ahead and say hello? Hello. All right, fantastic. We can hear you. You're a little low, so make sure you stay close to the mic.
Okay, let me get closer to my computer.
All right, fantastic. So Julia actually almost joined us in the last one. She was one of the alternate presenters we had lined up for last time around, and luckily she was still available to give a presentation today. And today she's going to be talking about how, earlier I mentioned how Tolkien's still influencing writers today. So Juliet's going to describe how that's happening right here, right now. So do you have any slides to share?
I do, actually.
Okay, go ahead and share those just to make sure that we're all good there.
Yeah, I know. I'm trying to figure out the best way to do that. So my apologies there. I should have, copying, pasting the meeting code. The meeting link isn't working. Let me think about this. there a share screen button? Ah, I'll just do that. I don't like that, but that'll do. Okay, my apologies there. Where's present? There we go. Okay.
All right. You are not sharing your screen currently.
Buggers. Should have decided to, oh, entire screen. Okay, yeah, entire screen. Share. There we go. Sorry about that.
All right, fantastic. I can see your screen, so please take it away.
All right. Okay, so again, my apologies for the small snafu there. My brain is not always functioning first thing in the morning, but okay. So anyway, I'm going to be doing, as you can see here, fantasy from classic to modern. So I'm just going to take a brief second to explain kind of what that is. So, okay, classic just means something that's very poetically written. It's not necessarily something really old, but it's just something that it's just very poetically written, usually with a more elaborate writing style. Modern is very clean lined. It can be a little more slangy. Either the slang is invented for the world or it's using modern slang. So basically just that's the basic difference. And now I'll get into my actual presentation, which is this. All right, so Tolkien has inspired so many writers, way too many to count, in fact. So I'll be talking about two of, he's inspired Robert Jordan, who wrote the Wheel of Time series, and Brandon Sanderson, who is working on the Stormlight Archive, which is an ongoing series. All right. Okay, so the Wheel of Time series. There's actually a lot going on with this particular series. There's a royal ton of very elaborate subplots and things like that. But basically, the basic plot is this, and this is really pared down. Just otherwise, I could be here for hours, quite happily. Okay, so basically, the Dark Lord is stuck in his prison, and he wants out, and he is absolutely determined to destroy everything and everyone in his way. And as you can see here, this is a list. This is a representation of all the main characters. The tall red-headed guy right here in the middle with the markings on his arms is Rand al'Thor. He's the guy who's born to defeat the Dark Lord. And of course, the guy the Dark Lord most wants to annihilate. The other people are friends who join him on his journeys, and they all have their own separate adventures while they're all trying separately to destroy the Dark Lord. All right, so Robert Jordan versus Tolkien. Okay, so basic writing style. Jordan is more campy, more melodramatic, more dramatic. Which can make for a really fun read, but it can also make for some exaggerations. The characters, when they're shocked, aren't just shocked. Their eyes will actually bulge out of their heads. And some characters, when they're frustrated, they will actually basically just pull out their hair when they're that frustrated, almost literally. Okay, but the main really interesting difference is in kind of some use of some side characters. So we've got the guy who isn't Gollum. We got Gollum here, and then the other guy is Padan Fain. He's character from the Wheel of Time series. Okay, so his occupation is he's a peddler, and he supplies the small town where Rand and his friends are from with all kinds of miscellaneous goodies. So at first you see him and think, oh, this is a good guy. Well, no. He got taken over by the Dark Lord some years ago, so he operates as the Dark Lord's eyes and ears in this world. And basically, in the first couple books in the series, he doesn't really have a very clear purpose. Later on, it becomes clear, but early on, his main purpose seems to be to wander around and say horribly creepy things and just be a horribly creepy person. He's actually a really interesting character as to what ultimately happens with him, but if I get into that, well, that would take a really long time. So I'm going to stick just to saying that much. But all right, then we have Gollum on the other side with Tolkien. Okay, so Gollum actually does, and I know he's talked about a little bit in the last presentation as well, so I'll keep it fairly brief. But Gollum actually was a hobbit, and he saw the ring came to his little place where he was living with the other hobbits. This is a different place in the Shire. And one of his very best friend gets the ring, and he thinks, ooh, that's it. I want that. So he murders his friend to get the ring. Okay, so that is Gollum's backstory. That is how he ended up with the ring. He was not a very nice person to begin with, honestly. And when he got the ring, it turned him into this little gnarled, twisted, yes, my precious sort of person. So in first reaction, his purpose in Tolkien stories is going to look really similar to Padan Fain, someone who's just kind of there to be this eerie thing. But Tolkien uses him to illustrate, okay, this is what could happen to Frodo if he gets too fond of carrying the ring for too long. So that's kind of the interesting thing is Robert Jordan is actually a bridge writer. He's in between the classic style of Tolkien and a more modern style, someone like Brandon Sanderson. So a lot of the stuff, what can be interesting about a writer that's more in between like that is that you're going to see a lot of these intriguing little side characters, and you're kind of looking at them going, I wonder if they're going to choose a different path later or not. In Padan Fain's case, I believe not. But anyway, so contrasting with Tolkien, Gollum does get a very small redemptive arc at the end of this, kind of accidentally. When he's traveling with Frodo and Sam, he tries harder to be his original self rather than this twisted Gollum thing. All right, so now we're going to be talking about Brandon Sanderson, the Stormlight Archive. Okay. Unlike the other two series, which are set on Earth or something that comes across as reasonably Earth-like, the Stormlight Archive is actually set on an alien planet called Roshar, which is itself embedded in this whole universe called the Cosmere, which I won't get into because the main thing I've currently read set there is the Stormlight Archive. So anyway. The basic plot of it is very similar to the other two in that you've got there's a war amongst the gods that these people worship, and the one who's the most aggressive is Odium. He is not a nice person. He is the god of passion, which means that there's no morality for him. He's just all about, if it feels good to me in this moment, I'm going to do it now, and that's actually portrayed as a bad thing because there's no morality there. Anyway, there's a group of people called the Knights Radiant. They bond with these little creatures called Spren, and that gives them superpowers. Again, there's more of a plot to this as well, but that's the basic description. All right, so Sanderson versus Tolkien. Okay, Sanderson is a full modern guy, so his writing style is definitely going to be a little bit more anyway, the books are really lengthy, so it's not necessarily more to the point, but there's not going to be as much detail in the writing. There's a lot of invented slang for the world, which is fun to read. Basically, but the biggest difference you're going to see is actually in the characters a little bit. Now, the interesting thing is here, and I'll get to that in a second. Okay, so here I've got Boromir from Lord of the Rings, and then we've got Dalinar Kholin over here from the Stormlight Archive. Okay, so over here on Boromir from Lord of the Rings. All right, so this is someone who is portrayed as, you're introduced to Boromir in the book. This is somebody very honorable. This is somebody who really takes the whole matter of the War of the Ring very, very seriously. This is someone who is well known for being loyal and for being a good man in a tight space. Those are all the things that Boromir has going for him. But this character does have a little flaw that nobody really thought much of. The guy's a little bit greedy. It's not substantial at this point. It's a small flaw. But later on, he will try to take the ring. He tries to take the ring from Frodo by force. And this causes the Fellowship to split up, actually. He does realize that, oh no, I did some, oh no. So then he does try to fix it, but it's a little, anyway, so he does sacrifice his life to try and save Merry and Pippin from the orcs. So that's kind of the cool thing about Boromir there. This is someone who is really, this character might make a huge, horrible mistake. This character might make a big mistake, but when he does, he makes sure he makes it right, even if that is ultimately his end. All right, so we're going to be talking, all right, now let's look at Dalinar Kholin over here. All right, so this character actually, he's the brother of the king, and he's always kind of secretly wanted to be king. He knows power is a huge temptation for him. And his backstory is far more dark. I won't go into it here because that would give away something, but let's just say his backstory is far more dark. He's a far more broken person. He is a very honorable person and tries really, really hard to do the right thing. But if sometimes circumstances will conspire against him, or his own desire for power in the moment may actually prevent him from seeking after what is most right in that situation, and then he does become radiant. So that's a further level of complication, because then he needs to do the right thing for his, to keep the bond with the spread intact. Okay, so kind of what's interesting about Dalinar Kholin is that he's actually very similar to Boromir. They're very, very similar in a lot of ways. Both are very honorable people, and both will do whatever they can think of to complete their mission. Okay. The interesting thing is about kind of Sanderson versus Tolkien here is that, and this is pretty common across the board in modern fantasy as well, is that in classic fantasy like Tolkien, you have situations where it's very clear the characters know what the right decision is, and it's situations are more clear cut. They in general they know exactly, okay, I know what the right decision is here. That's what made Warmer's decision ultimately so tragic. He knew it was the wrong thing to do. All right, whereas in a modern story, you're going to see a little bit more, you're going to see more ambiguous situations where there's really no concrete right decision. You're going to see characters who are a little bit more they're a little more broken themselves, so they're going to have a harder time seeing what is ultimately most right. All right. So that's kind of the interesting thing about Sanderson versus Tolkien here. Is the most interesting thing for me is that his whole series is about the characters kind of learning how to do what's right and how to resolve their own inner darkness before they can really move forward with saving the world. So that's kind of what I really like about Mr. Sanderson. That's really an interesting thing to read. All right. So ultimately, what makes Tolkien so inspiring? All right. Well, for me, it's because this guy, he writes such a detailed, elaborate world. It is so detailed and so elaborate that you feel like you could just crawl inside the book and explore everywhere. And in fact, there is one interesting thing just on a world building standpoint, which is, okay, so you know how in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, it's two, Elrond and is described as a great scholar. This guy has tons of books holed up somewhere. This guy has a library, a huge, wonderful library. Well, here's the funny thing. You actually, when you're exploring Rivendell in both The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, the library is implied, but you actually never physically go there. That's always been really intriguing to me. Why are you never going there? I mean, obviously because nothing would happen for pages except for people leafing through books going, ooh, goody, which is fine with me, but, you know, that's going to kill the story. So ultimately, you could imagine that place for, but he gives you enough details about how Rivendell is built that you could actually construct it for yourself and go there yourself if you wanted. Anyway, just kind of a silly little side note. Tolkien is so inspiring because of this, the world building detail. And then another factor as well is that it's actually a similar theme that I talked about with Mr. Sanderson as well. Is dealing with characters who, writing about characters who do have some inner darkness in them, trying to resolve that. So ultimately, that is what makes Tolkien so inspiring. All right, and that is that, actually. There we go.
All right, fantastic, Juliet. You still there?
Thank you. Yep, I'm still here.
Excellent. So you had some hot debate in the chat channel here on favorite authors. I think, let's see, obviously Sanderson and Jordan came up. I threw out George R.R. Martin, not as a favorite author, but as somebody who needs an editor. Let's see, we had a few other people. Gene Wolfe. So thank you for sparking a lot of debate and conversation there.
Oh, interesting. Good. I'm glad.
Yeah. So if you were recommending a first, or not a first, but of some of the authors that you just talked about there, which is your favorite? Which resonates the most with you?
Ooh, okay. Out of these three.
Yeah, I'm scoping it down a little bit.
Okay. Okay. Let me see. Well, to be honest, I actually like them all three evenly, but I will pick someone just in the interest of having someone to pick. Probably Tolkien out of these three, actually. Just I really want to get to that library.
That's a good answer. You know your audience.
Yep.
All right. So I'm going to go ahead and mute you here. And next up we have, let's see, let's mute that. Next up we have Kiran Saulnier. Honestly, of the last time we did this together in July, he had hands down my favorite presentation. All right, there he is. And it wasn't because it was on the characters or the depth of the complexity. It was because it was on the geography of Middle Earth. And you don't think about the geography of Middle Earth and what it means and how it came about. You think, oh, well, it's just kind of randomly generated. Tolkien just sprung out of his head. He put that notion to rest completely. And I really deeply appreciate that. And so he's back to join us again. Hello and good morning.
Hello, Keith. Thanks very much for having me again. The presentation I'll be delivering is part 2 of the same that I did last time. So rather than dealing on the geography, it's the chronology I'll be addressing. Now, give me a moment here to make sure I can set up my screen correctly.
Fantastic. And just so everyone knows, I did post the videos from the last time around. I believe I posted them in August. They're on the YouTube channel. I'll drop the chat or the link in the chat and it'll go out in the follow-up afterwards. So if you missed part 1, we'll forgive you. You'll have a chance to catch up afterwards. All right. I see you're trying to share and I see your screen. Please, the room is yours.
All right. You can all see Mapping Middle-earth Part 2, and that's Midgard in the center, yes?
That's correct, yes.
All right, well, here we go then. So as has already been mentioned by Keith, for those of you that were present, you may recall the following from my previous talk, and for those of you that were not, don't worry, I'll summarize it briefly here. My first Mapping Middle-earth presentation demonstrated that Middle-earth itself is not actually Tolkien's creation, but derives in fact from the sources that produce the image of Midgard that you can see here. So that's ancient Germanic mythology from which we get Thor, for example, with whom I trust you're all familiar. Now, it didn't take me very long to walk you through how this image, the world of men surrounded by the mountains and a realm of ice on one side and fire on the other, is actually meant to be Europe. Of course, things became complicated once one of Tolkien's quotes told us explicitly that his Middle-earth is the exact same thing. So, in other words, it's actually meant to be Europe. Now, explaining that was the main focus of Mapping Middle-earth Part 1. So if you don't quite understand how it works, that's okay. But I do recommend, as Keith said, that you watch the recording of the last Society of Tolkien seminar on YouTube. For the current presentation, all you need to know is the conclusion of that presentation, which is the annotated map that you can see here on the right, which shows that much of the Eastern Mediterranean of Europe has been cut out, and the remnants have been squished westwards. Sorry, I got confused between left and right there. Again, you'll need to watch my previous talk if you want to understand how and why. Now, the last thing I'll address about this is that there is some disagreement from viewers concerning whether Gondor is meant to be Italy or Byzantium, i.e. Greece. All I have time for right now is to emphasize that I am trying not to flood you all with too many references, but believe me, there's little debate left to be had about the conclusion of the last talk. This isn't guesswork. My sources are actually direct quotes from Tolkien himself, of which from his letters alone, I have 17. That being said, you'll see soon enough why the Byzantium guess isn't completely wrong. Tolkien himself draws the comparison. Let's start now on this presentation's topic, which, rather than dealing with where is Middle-earth, deals instead with when is Middle-earth. Now, on this topic, I have one very important note for all of you. On many different occasions, Tolkien told interviewers when Lord of the Rings takes place. Oh, great, problem solved. Okay. I'm going to emphasize now, you cannot take those seriously. And that becomes clear really quickly if you look at all the different examples. Tolkien contradicts himself so often, switching between 6,000 years ago and just a few centuries ago. He was not trying to be genuine. He was trying to shut people up who were asking stupid questions and trying to force modern historical and political interpretations onto his work. We are, of course, all quite familiar with that today. So let me show you when The Lord of the Rings takes place within Tolkien's own work. Meet Ælfwein. Are you confused? That's okay. Tolkien never actually published anything about Ælfwein, and it wasn't until Christopher Tolkien published The History of Middle-earth that we found out who Ælfwein is. Now, The History of Middle-earth isn't actually extra stories from J.R.R. Tolkien, but rather an explanation from Christopher about how his father made the Silmarillion, all the different versions of the texts. In these volumes, we discover that Tolkien actually intended to have the Silmarillion be imagined as written not by himself, but by an ancient mariner named, well, eventually Ælfwein, but different name at first. The reason Ælfwein never actually appears in the Silmarillion itself is because Tolkien wrote different versions of him. By the time Christopher was putting the Silmarillion together from his father's work, he was unsure which version of the mariner he should include. So rather than risk choosing the wrong one, he simply left him out. In the end, Christopher makes the reasonable conclusion that rather than Ælfwein, it is actually Bilbo Baggins who is intended to be the author of the Silmarillion while he was staying in Rivendell during the events of The Lord of the Rings. That's where he writes There and Back Again, or The Hobbit. Now, there's a catch to this, but in order to understand it, we first have to deal with the problem of the different versions of Ælfwein. You'll see why towards the end. Christopher's issue seems to have been that he didn't know why his father abandoned the older versions, but having studied medieval folklore and history, I believe I know why. So the first version of Tolkien's mariner is called Otor. He lives in the 5th century, so in Europe. That's easy enough. But the strange parts of this story are that Otor is supposed to have been the father of Hengist and Horsa, who are the Germanic warriors that founded England in our own history. And the second part is that the Lonely Isle, which is the island to which Frodo sails at the end of the Lord of the Rings movies, I assume you know what I'm talking about, the Lonely Isle becomes the island of Britain. Here's why these are strange. I remind you that Tolkien intended for the events in his works to be the history of our own world. So the first problem with that is that Hengist and Horsa already have a recorded father in our history, and it isn't Otor. And secondly, as Christopher points out in his father's work, The Fall of Arthur, the Lonely Isle is meant to be what we would now know as Avalon. So that's the island to which King Arthur sails as he's dying from Britain. So no, they can't be the same place. And Tolkien figured that out. He was very young when he wrote this. It becomes obvious fairly quickly why the Otor version of Tolkien's mariner doesn't work, so he tried again. Now, the second version is finally called Ælfwein, and it's much better. He's just some guy, so doesn't conflict with the founders of England. But here are two new problems with this version. Firstly, he lives around 1066, as in during the time of the Norman conquest. For those who don't know, this is the event that is credited with destroying ancient English culture. So no, it's not likely that ancient Germanic myths like the Silmarillion got written down around that time. It's just not very convincing. It doesn't work. Well, I say it doesn't work. The year does work, but it's not a great choice. But secondly, and here's the really big issue, England is no longer the Lonely Isle. Instead, it's now on the western coast of Beleriand from the Silmarillion. Yeah, remember how I demonstrated in Mapping Middle-earth Part 1 that you can do this to Middle-earth of the Third Age? Yeah, you can't do that with Beleriand at all. I actually know how Tolkien made Beleriand, though I'm saving that, if you guys would like to hear it, for Mapping Middle-earth Part 3. But in short, Beleriand will not work as Europe. So then, why for the first and second version of his mariner did Tolkien keep trying to force England into being a mythical land? Well, actually, the answer is fairly simple. Everything that Tolkien wrote, he wrote in part for England, as you can see on in the quote on your right. Tolkien was a nationalist, although not the let's all do World War I and II kind of nationalist. He loved his country and understandably put it first. But of course, he knew his attempts at making it a mythical land in his mythology, they weren't really working. And interestingly, he stopped trying for the third and final version of his Mariner. This is where you want to listen carefully. This is the part that's going to work. This is why. Now, I don't have time to explain what Tolkien discovered about this Ing person. That I could do in another presentation, again, if you guys are interested. But the point is, Ing is the reason why Tolkien stops trying to force England to be mythical, and why the third and final version of his Mariner does work. So here's what we have for the second Ælfwein, which is the third and final version of the Mariner. He lives during the period of English contact with the Vikings, so a period of Germanic cultural renewal. So great, that works very well. Again, he's just some guy. And finally, Britain is just Britain. Nothing fancy. There's nothing more to say. This version works. But of course, as you've seen, it was a very confusing process to figure this out. So is Christopher right that his father abandoned Ælfwein in favor of Bilbo? Maybe Tolkien did consider Bilbo as a potential replacement, but here's the catch that I mentioned earlier. In Tolkien's letters, we learn that he finished writing The Lord of the Rings in 1948, and by 1950 had finished all of his major revisions. So Bilbo had been completed by that time. The final time Tolkien wrote about Ælfwein, however, was in a text called the Dangwaith Pengolodh, which, and here I quote directly from Christopher, cannot have been written before 1951. So, in other words, a year after he's done with Bilbo. After Tolkien had already completed Bilbo, he then went back to working on Ælfwein. That doesn't look like replacement to me. So it begins to look as though Tolkien never stopped wanting Ælfwein to be the author of the Silmarillion, even if he wasn't sure that his final version worked. Okay, there you go. Great. We're done working with the problem, the different versions of the Mariner. Why does this matter? Well, this is why. This quote from Christopher Tolkien is from the introduction of the History of Middle-earth, Volume 1. Now, can you see what has just happened here? This is from a section where Christopher is talking about the authorship of the Silmarillion. So either we have to assume that, for no particular reason, the author of the Silmarillion, who was trying to record the entire history of Middle-earth, just got bored after the events of the Third Age and stopped writing anything else, which again, that's a contradiction of why Tolkien made the Silmarillion. Or the end of the Third Age was all he really knew, because he lived right around that time. Nothing else has happened. That's why the Silmarillion ends at the Third Age. Now, as a medieval historian myself, the only adjustment I would make to this is to say that Ælfwein is not right at the end of the Third Age, but right at the beginning of the Fourth Age. Because what happens when we make the end of the Third Age, not the year 918, but closer to the year 800, is that we begin to see how closely the parallels with old European history begin to line up for no less than 6 of the major ending events of the Third Age. And we can see how Aragorn, as the restorer of the Dunedain kingdoms, is given the same descriptions as Charlemagne, who, sure enough, restored the Roman Empire in the year 800. Or we could also see how the restored Dunedain kingdoms themselves cover almost exactly those areas on our annotated map with which we can credit the restored Roman Empire. And here at last, Byzantium enters the picture. Of course, Gondorian culture was similar to Byzantine culture. They are both the Roman Empire. Do you see where we are now? But then that means the Byzantine Empire is actually acknowledged on Middle-earth's map as Lord of the Rings is ending. Why? Well, because we've come to the end of the story. Here's why it's strange for those who don't remember. I said in Mapping Middle-earth Part 1 that the Eastern Mediterranean had to be cut out of the map of Middle-earth because the strong cultures there would have overwhelmed the Northern European mythology that Tolkien wanted us to focus on in his work. But at the end of the Third Age, the elves are all gone. Just like how after Charlemagne, Germanic culture became overwhelmed by the restored Roman culture. That really is when the elves left in our real history. In both cases, the race of men is cut off from the ancient magic, but left alone in an ever-darkening world. But the story has still been worth telling, especially for those who are willing to do the work to discover when and where the Lord of the Rings is, and just how much of it really did happen. That's all I've got for today.
Oh, that was fantastic. I loved understanding the where beforehand, but the when I think is really cool. We had a lot of debate around let's see. Yeah, Terena is excited about Aragorn as Charlemagne. That's awesome. That's fantastic to hear. No, this is really cool. So what are you going to cover in part 3? Because I've already volunteered you for our next session.
Yeah, that's no problem. So there's a lot of questions here. I'm not going to be able to answer all of these, I think. So what I'm going to do, guys, I'm going to throw my email in the chat here. Send me anything. I already answered questions about Tolkien. For part 3, I talked about Beleriand, right? Now, with Beleriand, you can't just look at the map of Europe and say, yeah, here's all these different places where the myths happened. But you can reconstruct Beleriand actually from the 2 Eddas, which are the Norse texts from which we get almost all of Norse mythology. That's going to be a long presentation, but I'll see if I can cut it down to a reasonable period.
Fantastic, fantastic. Okay, so I'm promoting James to being a panelist. All right. Kiran, once again, thank you. Sincerely appreciate it. This is fantastic.
Thanks, guys. Again, my email will be in the chat. Cheers.
Excellent. And I'll definitely tap you for the next time around. So I did want to take a quick sidebar before I introduce James. We do have our first corporate sponsor here this year, or this session. So I want to tell everyone about Sackville Baggins Estate Planning Services. If you have any needs, any wants, if you really care about what your property is going to do after you're dead, talk to Sackville Baggins. It's a fantastic service. Definitely check them out. Their tagline is just die already. We'll take care of it. So with that terrible joke, I'm going to pass it off to James. James is a Catholic film director who's worked with people all over the place, and he's here to talk about the power of creation and how it works and how it's going about. Let's see. James, are you there?
I am here. Hey, Keith.
All right. Fantastic and welcome. Are you sharing your screen? Or are you going to?
I will be sharing my screen, yes. Eventually. I'm not doing it yet. I'm actually finding that my video is not working. I don't think you guys can see me, can you?
Saw you briefly.
Well, hopefully I'm just seeing a spinning Mac wheel of death right now, trying to get my videos.
So right now we see a W logo and it says magic. Oh, there you go.
Great.
Brilliant.
Hey, everyone. Move this here so that, okay. All right. So Keith, thank you so much for having me on here.
Happy to have you. Please take it away.
I will. Okay. Wow. First, I just want to say that was an amazing talk that just came right before. I feel honored to be able to be a part of this and speaking. I feel like I'm talking to people that were speaking the same language. So that's super exciting. I will go ahead and, before I share my screen. So I'm talking about Tolkien and subcreation, using Morgoth as a sort of case study for us. Now, why is this important? Before I dive into the presentation, this is important because we're walking in a Mirkwood. It's a lot of there's a lot that's going on that could be perceived as darkness. And through subcreation, Tolkien is showing us how he can, how we add to the enrichment of the world. Now, I have a quote that's written right above my computer where I do most of my work, and I don't know where it came from because it's for me, but I know Tolkien wrote it, and I've forgotten. It's been up there so long that I've forgotten where it came from. But what he writes is, in fantasy, he, the sub-creator, may actually assist in the affiliation and multiple enrichment of creation. So that's the calling of the artist. That's the calling of those that create stories and tell them and share them. We're bringing light, enrichment, and foliation to a murky world. And that's what I'm talking about today, and I hope you take some enjoyment from it. Okay, I'll go ahead and share my screen. Oops. Go ahead, try that again. Apologies.
You had it for a moment the first time.
Yeah, that's unfortunate here. We're having some internet issues here. Let's see here.
This is always one of the fun things about live presentations, everyone. All the technical issues definitely pop up at the last second.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. Okay, I think we're right now.
You're all set now, please.
Yeah, great. Okay, so a bit about me. Keith told me said a little bit about me already. I'm a filmmaker, work in feature films, network streaming televisions, agency, ministries. I do basically all the hats because I find that to be an artist, you have to do a lot of things to put food on the table to feed the family, and so that's why we've had the family be able to be fed for right now. I work a lot in marketing of recent. If you want to find out more about me, check out the podcast, PinetoBrothers.com or PinetoBrothers.com, but also on YouTube, the Pinedo Brothers podcast. My brother and I host a podcast about art. I wrote and directed a film called The Extrovert. And that is a feature-length film that premiered internationally. But the reason why I wanted to bring this up is you need to know a little bit about my bias. Coming as a filmmaker, I'm going to be talking, I'm not an academic. I'm going to be talking about art and story and co-creation and sub-creation, and just getting excited about these concepts that Tolkien did so well. I won't be speaking, I'll probably be mispronouncing a lot of words. I won't be speaking from an academic perspective, and I apologize about that in advance. Okay, introduction here. We'll talk about sub-creation. We'll define what that is according to Tolkien and how he used it within his own storytelling. We'll look at a brief example for how that is used for ill, because there can be positive or negative effects of subcreation. And Tolkien has a perfect example of that within his Silmarillion through the case study of Morgoth. And then we'll look at a positive example of all of this. The exfoliation and enrichment, like I spoke about earlier, we'll look at a couple of good examples of that. Okay, in Tolkien's own words, this is a letter that he wrote to his buddy C.S. Lewis. I'll just read it because it's beautiful. Man is not wholly lost or wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned. Man, sub-creator, the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues and endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind. Through all the crannies of the world we filled, with elves and goblins, though we dared to build gods and their houses out of dark and night, and sowed the seed of dragons, 'twas our right. So man, the sub-creator, the refracted light. That gives us more of an idea. Okay, so what is Tolkien's sub-creation? Let's break it down more. Non-allegorical, but metaphorical. You might have read some of his letters where he wrote how, again, to C.S. Lewis, he was not a huge fan of allegory. That's important because He was always trying to surprise the reader with his storytelling. He was creating in fantasy worlds that would reflect a bit of light and then be able to surprise and show a hidden truth that we hadn't perceived before. So that's the power of metaphor, is the ability to surprise, like a splash by joy, or as C.S. Lewis would say, surprised by joy, a hidden light that's reflected and refracted from the source, which Tolkien's story in the Silmarillion would be Ivatar. But for us, the source is different. Now, subcreation can be positive or can be negative. So examples of how you can judge if it's positive or negative is by the fruits. By the fruits you will judge them. So we're going to look at what a positive example is later on, but first we'll show a negative really soon. Now, a really important thing is this is not a completely free act. Subcreation, you are bound, as G.K. Chesterton would say, you're bound in creating by the borders of your frame. When you're painting, the frame binds what you're able to paint upon, your canvas, so to speak. It's the same thing with Tolkien's subcreation. He would work tirelessly to find the right words to say. He created his own languages finding the right words to say. So, his buddy Sayers would also talk about this. Sayers would say the sub-creator is not completely free to find what happens next in the story and then just write it down. There's only one right thing that could happen in a story. Tolkien, there's only one right word, and maybe it might not exist. He might have to create it. So this is an exciting thing because it allows us to show, it gives credence to the toil that artists have to endure in order to create a story. It's not a random collection of sounds, like some modern music could be said as, it's just a collection of sounds. No, it's actually ordered sounds is what music is. And just in that way, Tolkien saw it as not a completely free act, but something that he had to toil at for long and hard, and it was an arduous journey in order to find the right words. Okay, so here we'll talk about the negative examples of co-creation, of subcreation, through Tolkien's own work, his own character, Morgoth, the evil one that comes into being at the beginning of the Silmarillion. So if you've read it, forgive me because I'm going to recap a bit of it. But at the very beginning, Ivatar, the one who exists, decides to create, and in his creation, Tolkien uses a metaphor of a symphony, a sound, a gorgeous collection of sounds that makes a beautiful music. And from that, creation comes into being. From that act of creating music, creation comes. Now, Morgoth is created by the music, and then he wants to join into the sound, into the music that is all around him. And what he does is he values the sound of his own creation above that which is in front of him, above the creators. He does not see of himself as happy to just be a sub-creator, but must be a creator. And so he creates just noise to drown out the sound. And this is two levels of metaphor here. Tolkien is speaking metaphorically about creation, but then he's also, within his metaphor, showing how the power of subcreation is used for evil. It's a misdirection of the subcreative power. And it's something that we see very often these days when we value our message above just refracting light that we see in the world. Then we become propaganda makers. And this is not saying that this is left liberal Hollywood that's doing it only. Of course, you see that in the mainstream. I don't like using that word. I like saying you see that in the old world sort of media creation, but you also see it from indie films, from people like me that are trying to punch upward. When we value our own message too much, we're acting as Morgoth. Instead of creating within the bounds of our story that has been set before us and laid before us, within the rules that we're trying, something that we're trying to bring into being, something that Tolkien did so well. Okay, so enrichment and affiliation. This is the positive aspects of subcreation, of that we can see so well with a character like Finrod Felagund, where the harp that he plays added to the wisdom of those that listened. This is again in the Silmarillion. When those who could hear the music he created, they found that their wisdom grew. And this is also harkens back to Leaf by Niggle. This is actually my favorite of Tolkien. It's hard to say. I love Tolkien so much. But Leaf by Niggle, if you haven't read it, check it out. It's something that's worth exploring because it's basically an autobiography of Tolkien. He's speaking about what he saw as his works. He spends, like, this is the painter, Niggle right there, and he's spending infinite amount of time on that tiny little bit, that tiny little blade of grass, that tiny little leaf. And in the end, it doesn't matter so much if no one ever sees what he's doing. What matters is that the act of it itself is good, that act of creation is good, and that makes the toil worth it, despite the fact that Tolkien thought no one would ever read perhaps his books when he was spending so much time upon them. Of course, that wasn't true. Tolkien was wrong about that. He was a smart guy, but not 100% right all the time. And that didn't happen, though, in Leaf by Niggle. No one ever actually saw Niggle's beautiful painting, with the exception of one little leaf that they put into the museum. And that leaf became famous because of how beautiful that one little leaf was, Leaf by Niggle. So that's a little bit of example of the positive aspects. I hope that those might listen, that who to us might grow in wisdom, and that the act of creating it itself is an enriching act to the world. It's an exciting thing. I find it inspiring. Okay, a few more points of difference. Let's look at Finrod Felagund versus Morgoth here, as we're using metaphors that Tolkien created to show a truth about creating metaphors. A little bit of Inception, I think, sort of metaphor within a metaphor. So the first point, respect for the past. Finrod and the elves and Tolkien had a deep respect for the past as they were creating. While Morgoth, on the other hand, there's a desire to throw it off, to see that there's nothing worthwhile that came before, that I am the soul's truth, the sole source of truth, or the people that I'm creating with. So that's something that's really important, respect for past. Now, beauty and metaphor versus message. If the message becomes more important than the beauty that we're creating, the refracted light that we're showing, then we are creating propaganda, and we're just pushing a message that we think others need to hear. It's something that Tolkien would not do. Big point of difference there. Okay, one is done for goodness, another is done for power and domination. Now, you hear so much talk about in this day and age about how the patriarchy is just one long history of a desire to dominate and enforce our will upon the other, and the patriarchy's will upon those that the patriarchy oppresses. Well, that might be too much of a protestation, because you're revealing more about what you want and desire when you say that sort of thing. We have, in our desire to create, we don't want to dominate, but we want to spread beauty and enrichment to the entire world. And that is not, how can I say it? That is a different, we're speaking of different desires. One is a desire for power, and another is a desire for joy, to spread goodness. And there's an excitement and a light airiness to it. Chesterton would say, angels are able to fly because they take themselves so lightly. There's a lightness in it, in a true subcreation. And that's what we see in Tolkien. Even though he was speaking about dark and difficult things, he still considered himself lightly. So that's a little bit of what I have to say. Just to conclude, there's much reasons for hope. There's much darkness out there, but divine creation always fuels human creativity, and it's a constant call. And it's not just for artists, but anyone that's out there, look for light. Don't say no to that which is making us angry and wants us to bring us down to the depths of darkness. Look for the light that's out there, because always it's coming from the source of light. And there are those that will always heed the call and refract it and spread it in their art, in their interactions with a human person. And we can find it. So there's much reasons for hope. Thank you for this talk. I'll cede the ground now for any questions. Check out the bibliography here if you have, that's a far better source than anything you guys could ask me. Keith, I hope I didn't go over time. I lost track.
No, you're just fine. We're running a couple minutes late. So if you want to go another couple minutes, you're fine there too. So we do have some time for some questions. First of all, I do have a question. Are these slides going to be available afterwards? Can you send them to me so I can share them and post them and stuff like that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to.
Brilliant. Yeah, I'd love to be able to dig into some of these bibliography. I also like the fact that if you're talking early on, you said how one word is so important, and one word ties it all together. And if he didn't have the word, he created it. He invented his own languages. I thought that was a fascinating reference back to what Terena was talking about at the very beginning about describing the two types of holes. Here's a hole that's comfortable, that's lovely, that has food, that has all these things, and here's a dark, dank hole that has worms.
Yeah, absolutely. Where do you want to walk, and where must you walk? It's an absolute interesting idea between being able to describe that which maybe you have to go into the dark hole to find the words to describe it. But maybe not. It's an interesting comparison. Absolutely.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you again. Let's see. Next up, we've got Kevin Williams. Okay, so I'm going to turn off your camera. Kevin, if you could go ahead and turn on yours. Fantastic. There you go. So Kevin has the dubious distinction of being one of our other alternates last time around. Thank you again to Kevin. He stepped into a breach that I was a little nervous that we were going to fill at the time, but he did so fantastically. So he is definitely on my short list this time around. And Kevin's also didn't get this until his bio came through the other day. If you're familiar with Christian devotionals, there's a series called Our Daily Bread, who has been out there forever. I remember growing up, it being on the table at church. Kevin actually works for Our Daily Bread. So today he's going to talk about finding God in the second age of Middle Earth. And then after that, I'll have some brief closing statements and we will get back to our Saturday. So Kevin, could you say hello just so I know your mic's working?
I can say hello. Hello.
Fantastic. Welcome. Do you have slides to share?
I do, and I'm attempting to share now. Do you see them?
Brilliant. I see them.
Super.
That's a good sign.
All right.
All right. And I see presenter mode. All right. Please, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, it is great to be with everybody. Genuinely. I enjoyed the one in the summer. I've looked forward to this. I have enjoyed every one of these sessions today, and I think James set this one up for me beautifully, and I appreciate that. So yes, I have written a book, Finding God in Second Age of Middle Earth. I have learned the hard way what the editorial process is like. I'd hope to have it done by now. That's probably going to be January before the thing comes out. So I have a whole lot more content than what I had time to prepare or put together for this morning. But just to give you get started here, since time is of the essence, an introduction to the Second Age. Where the Silmarillion differs from Tolkien's earlier works is in its refusal to accept novelistic convention. That was written by Christopher Tolkien in his book, The Book of Lost Tales, Part 1, and actually in the page 1. And when you get into the Second Age, that is most certainly true, because you end up with a chapter on the Second Age. It's 58 pages long. It's more of an outline than a detailed novel. You don't really get any genuine character development except for Sauron. So there's 3,300 plus years packed into 58 pages in the Silmarillion. And given that Amazon Studios is coming out with a series, supposedly or reportedly to come out on September 22nd of 2022, that would be Frodo and Bilbo's birthday. I wanted to dig into the Second Age and really get in touch with it before I see what Hollywood does to it. Not that they'll do anything bad. They may not. But I wanted to be up and up with myself, and then help others as well to see what some of the depth that Tolkien had put in there. So themes for today, I had any number of things that I'm not going to get to. I was going to talk about trees, and I was going to talk about eagles, and I was going to talk about the number 5. But what we've got time for this morning is corruption, the fall, light versus darkness. And thank you, James, for setting that up for me. And we will begin with corruption. So in the letters by Tolkien, he writes, but at the beginning of the Second Age, Sauron was still beautiful to look at, or could still assume a beautiful visible shape, and was not indeed wholly evil, not unless all reformers who want to hurry up with reconstruction and reorganization are wholly evil, even before pride and the lust to exert their will eat them up. So wrap your mind around that for a moment. Sauron, Morgoth's most trusted lieutenant in the First Age, who had done all variety of evil acts. Tolkien tells us at the beginning of the Second Age, he was not yet wholly evil. And I have a hard time wrapping my head around that, simply because that means Tolkien had a bit of a different definition, or a level, or a magnitude, or a measure, or a benchmark that people had to reach to be considered wholly evil. And for whatever reason, Sauron hadn't met that yet. Here's a quote from St. Passos of Mount Athos. Evil walks in small steps. If it were to come all at once, we would not be deceived. That definitely in the Second Age describes Sauron. He'd gone into hiding for several centuries. By the time he reappears, he is quietly rebuilding his empire. He is still beautiful to look at, as Tolkien just told us. He deceives many that he's coming bearing good gifts, when in fact he's slithering his way in through the shadows to upset the apple cart and try and take over the whole of Middle Earth. But we move to the island of Numenor, where the Numenorians are all living now. It was the land of gift. After the War of Wrath in the First Age, Morgoth is put into exile. This island rose up out of the sea, this 5-pointed star island, Numenor. And the men of the West inhabited it. And for many centuries, things were idyllic, things were beautiful. But ultimately, men became men, and corruption slipped in, and completely divorced of Sauron. Sauron was not on the island. Sauron was not having any input on the island until the very end. And Tolkien tells us in Silmarillion that but those that lived turned more eagerly to pleasure and revelry, desiring ever more goods and more riches. And men took weapons in those days and slew one another for little cause. The people murmured against the king and the lords, or against any that had aught that they had not. And so it begins with grumbling. It begins with discontent and gossip, and people who say that the murmuring, that this is not fair, that is not fair, that everyone agrees that that's not just, but nobody can quite explain what fair means. And all these whispers continue to multiply, often grounded in victimhood and covetousness. For believers, or for Christians, or for the Judeo-Christian tradition, the fear of Yahweh leads to life, then contentment. He rests and will not be touched by trouble. We get that from the book of Proverbs. That didn't happen in Numenor. They didn't rest in their knowledge of Eru, their god. Here's a very quick timeline of some things that happened. The 11th king of Numenor, Tar-Minastir, was the first king to openly fear death. Now, there had been mumbling, there had been grumbling before him, but he was the first king to openly declare that he was afraid of death because he didn't know what lied beyond death. And while the song that James was talking about in his presentation revealed much to the Valar about the elves and the dwarves, they didn't say anything about what the afterlife was supposed to be for humans. And so there was no Hall of Mandos, as far as they knew, waiting for them on the other side. And so they began to fear what death would mean. By the 12th king, Tar-Kiryatan, he plundered Middle-earth, so much so that the lesser men of Middle-earth grew to fear and hate the men of the West, the Numenorians. And he was judged to be the one that let the first coming of the shadow upon the bliss of Numenor to be seen. So up until this point, Tolkien tells us that this was bliss. It was beautiful. It was gorgeous. And indeed, by the time, centuries later, that Sauron comes, he can't believe the splendor of Numenor. It's beyond even his imagining. And so the first coming of the shadow, that taint of corruption, that impurity that we might, ritual impurity that we might think about in the scriptures. And then the 13th king, Tar-Atonimir, in his time, the shadow fell upon Numenor. And the king spoke openly against the band of the Valar, and their hearts were turned against the Valar and the Eldar. And so step by step, piece by piece, little by little, apart from the evil of Sauron, men's hearts are turning away from their creator, turning away from their god. 14th king, Tar-Ankalaman, he ended the open worship of Eru. The faithful were also called the Elendili. They were hunted, they were exiled, persecuted, and they were completely driven underground. Latter times, when Sauron is finally on the island, many of them were actually sacrificed in Sauron's abomination of the temple. And it was during this king's reign that the eagles of Manwë, the witnesses of Manwë, abandoned Numenor. They flew off into the Undying Lands, not to return. I had a lot more to tell you about the eagles and their part in the whole thing, but maybe that'll be another episode. And then finally, the 25th king, Ar-Pharazôn, usurps the throne through incest, becomes the last king of Numenor. Under the direct influence of Sauron, he ends up coming to worship darkness, and he leads an armada against the Valar. Such was his hubris that he thought he could take on the Valar. And ultimately, Numenor is not just swallowed into the abyss, but the entirety of Middle-earth is changed. Eru goes in and reshapes the entire planet so that no one can get to the Undying Land, so that no one can get to Aman. And Numenor, Tolkien tells us, was his Atlantis, and it sunk into the sea. Okay, the fall. We could say a lot more about corruption, and I even emailed Keith earlier. I had planned, I'd well over planned and had to cut back quite a bit. And there's a world more that we could say in many different subtexts. But the fall. So my impression is that the Silmarillion is oriented as much on a biblical pattern as it is on that of Norse and other mythologies. That comes from an author, Clyde Kilby. It's a very old book from 1976 called Tolkien and the Silmarillion. Kilby actually got to work with Tolkien for about 6 months and helped him compile notes that were scattered everywhere about the Silmarillion, because that was the project Tolkien was supposed to be focusing on. Discovered it was very difficult to get the man to focus. I recommend the book only because you can get some real insight into who Tolkien was and that development of the Silmarillion. But this statement that it was based as much on biblical pattern as that of Norse or other mythologies, does that cross-cultural diversity weaken in any way the premise that one can find the God of the Bible in the second age of Middle Earth? And my answer to that question is by no means. Because in Tolkien's worldview, there is only one overriding theme that supplants all other themes. And here he is speaking in one of his letters. I believe that legends and myths are largely made of truth. And indeed, present aspects of it can only be received in this mode. And long ago, certain truths and modes of this kind were discovered and must always reappear. There cannot be any story without a fall. All stories are ultimately about the fall. And interestingly enough, then, the story of Numenor in the book of the Silmarillion is called Akalabeth, the downfall. And that downfall becomes the very premise and the very underpinning that comes to shape the rest of the Second Age, and then well into the third, through the Third Age, and into the beginning of the Fourth. But the professor's worldview that all stories and all myths lead to one universal truth, which is the fall. And so all of this diversity of thought, that's probably why there are so many different translations of his books, is because this transcends culture. There's a truth behind everything. There's a flow underneath it that resonates in the hearts of men and women everywhere. But because there's a fall, there must also be a redemption, right? I forget which one here earlier talked about Boromir and his redemption. We see that happening throughout Tolkien's works. We see many falls. We see many hopes for redemption. So I'm going to jump genres here very quickly, and I hope you'll forgive me, but I'm going to talk about, of all things, Star Trek: The Next Generation. In its first season, Gene Roddenberry had gone through an awakening of sorts into New Age thought and thinking. And in his world, the Federation of Planets was this utopia. They'd done away with avarice, they'd done away with lust, they'd done away with power struggles, they'd done away with hunger and homelessness, and everything was beautiful and happy and lovely, and there were no problems. And for the writers in that first season, they had real problems. Because if everything is wonderful, what do you write about? If there's nothing to overcome, what are the challenges? If there's nothing there standing in the way of your success, how do you become an overcomer? And so, are the lessons there? Certainly. Gandalf literally falls, and we tremble inside. And this is a rhetorical question. I'm not looking for answers here. These are the things that I ask myself. Why? The Lady Gladriel is tempted by the One Ring, and we hold our breath. Why? We root for the ring bearer Frodo and even weep for him at times. Why? It's because all of us have some familiarity with each one of those characters to one degree or another. We've all had our fall. We've all had our opportunities to overcome. Some of us have succeeded, some of us haven't. But to quote Tolkien again, all stories are ultimately about the fall, and that includes yours, and that includes mine. All right, light versus darkness. And in her most excellent book, Splintered Light, and James, I think you would be interested in that if you haven't read it, by Verlin Flieger, because you're referencing the splintering of the light, the diffraction of the light. The Silmarillion is all about light. It is something that begins as a definite spiritual reality, becomes divided into pure human thinking and physical light, and further divides, both as precepts and as words, into a myriad fragments, all of which serve to express and describe Tolkien's world and those who dwell in it. And so, yes, we have from the very beginning of the books this concept of light versus darkness. We have that in the scripture as well, don't we? The very first act of God was to separate the light from the darkness. And the rest of the scripture, the rest of the entirety of scripture is all about how we live in the light or how we live in the darkness. That becomes the parallel, that we make choices, and which kingdom are we going to live and thrive in. So the Silmarillion, and the very first sentence of the Alcalabeth, it is said by the Eldar that men came into the world in the time of the shadow of Morgoth, and they fell swiftly under his dominion. For he sent his emissaries among them, and they listened to his evil and cunning words, and they worshipped the darkness, and yet feared it. Not very encouraging, is it? It's not quite so happy and cheery as a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. Not quite so playful as Mr. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End announced that he would shortly be celebrating his 111st birthday with a party of special magnificence. No, this starts out that men, the human beings, fell swiftly under the dominion of Morgoth and began to worship the darkness. And boy, could we spend a lot more time talking about that. So if you've read the stories, then you know that Numenor does fall into the abyss in what Tolkien refers to as a Noachian event, references to Noah and the ark. This Noachian event, 9 ships have been prepared and stocked and provisioned. And the faithful, the Elendili I referenced earlier, are on those boats. They've brought out artifacts and goods, including the white tree that would come to symbolize the kingdom of Numenor in Middle-earth. And they have come, settled. Morgoth has resisted. The One Ring, of course, has been forged already. Wars have been waged over all the rings of power. The elves have been embattled and embroiled. So have humans, so has dwarves. Sauron is known. Mordor has grown. The One Ring is sweeping to cover Middle-earth in that second darkness. But there is that last alliance of elves and men. They rise up, and there's a 7-year siege against Mordor and Sauron's fortress of Barad-dûr, until finally, one day, Gil-galad, the king of the elves, and Elendil, the king of the men of the west, all stand before Sauron. And we've seen in the films and read in the books, of course, that Narsil, the great sword of Elendil, which means fire and white light, is raised before Sauron, and that this sword that in the books, Elendil falls upon that sword and it breaks into several pieces, becoming the shards of Narsil. The hope would be, because it's now broken and shattered, diminished, the light has been rendered meaningless, that the Dark Lord Sauron should be able now to defeat the whole of Middle-earth and submit it to his dark power. But that's not what happens, is it? That's not how it ends at all. Narsil, though so thoroughly diminished, sundered, its light all but extinguished, was taken up by the sun, the firstborn of the High King, and with a defining blow, though thoroughly broken, was sufficient to sever the One Ring from Sauron's hand. With but the merest remnant of its former glory, its meager light was still sufficient to overcome the darkness. It was Sauron who was defeated, and whose forces fled, and whose fortress was brought low. Such a story. As Tolkien would say, it's the story of stories, a mirror to the scriptural reality. That Jesus crucified, whose light was all but extinguished, the firstborn son of the Most High King, wrought the defining blow. Though bruised and crushed, and with the merest remnant of his former glory, his light was more than sufficient to overcome the darkness. And it was Satan who was defeated. So let us therefore cast off the works of darkness, and let us put on the armor of light. Be encouraged, Do not let hope or the light fade in your own life. Thank you for your time. I do have a suggested reading list, which is here. And if you get the slides or the video, of course, you'll be able to go back and look some of that up. Most of this is not written from a Christian perspective, but definitely gives you some insights into things going on. And then here's how you can reach me via email if you like. Be happy to talk to you more about any of this. And then if you want to know about the book when it becomes available in January, I'll be very happy to share that. That's it.
Kevin, thank you. That was brilliant. Is the book available for pre-order now?
It is not. It is still being, as I mentioned earlier, this editorial process is, it's evil.
Yeah, I've been there, done that, and obviously we have a few writers in the group today, so we've been through various pains of that. Sincerely, thank you. I really appreciate that perspective. I would say if you can put things on, make it available for pre-order, that would be awesome.
Yep.
I will send out a link to whatever landing page you give me, all that fun sort of stuff, because I think it resonated with a lot of people. There was dead silence in the chat for a long time, but based on the comments I'm seeing now, I think it was more of a thoughtful focus as opposed to it wasn't engaged. So thank you.
That would be my wish and desire. So great. Thanks, Keith.
All right. I'm going to turn off your camera here. All right. Thank you. So let's see. Let me close out real quick. So that wraps our second Society of Tolkien webinar. Hopefully you had fun. You learned something. You met some other people who gave up their Saturday to enjoy something amazing here. Please make sure you say thank you to our speakers. Some of them have already dropped links in the chat. Kiran has been particularly prolific in that. Thank you. But if you enjoyed them, follow, like, share their work. If they drop me links, please, this is a note to speakers. If you drop me links, I'll happily share them in the follow-up. I promise I'll get this video out way faster, probably the next few days, and I'll send it out to everyone who has been registered for either the previous webinar or this one. So before I close out, I'm happy to announce that we're going to be doing this again. We'll get together in just over 3 months on January 29th. We're going to shift a little later in the day. 9 a.m. Central Time is great for me, not so great in the West Coast. So we'll shift that just a little bit later to 11 a.m. Central Time, so our West Coast friends can join us. And in fact, let me drop that link in the chat right now so you can register. The registration page is live currently, and it's also linked from the website itself. So if you go to societyoftolkien.org/schedule, you can go ahead and register there. But in closing, I want to leave you with a quick thought. When these speakers gathered, I realized we had a couple common threads, both creation and opposing the darkness. I think you heard that in every single presentation in some way. At the same time, there are people actively trying to tear down and destroy the things we love. I've called them orcs. And oh, that makes them mad, but I think it's spot on. You have to think about orcs. Orcs come to destroy and defile, just like some of these so-called fans. They claim to be scholars, but they're not. There's no thought or creation behind the words, just anger. They're angry they can't create the wonderful, beautiful things they can be proud of. And that is why they must tear down Tolkien and other creators of beauty. It's frustration and jealousy. I had a great explanation on why that is, but I think I'm going to defer to J.R.R. Tolkien himself. In Return of the King, Frodo is captured and taken to the Tower of Cirith Ungol, and Sam goes to rescue him. After Sam finds Frodo, he's desperate for food and says, quote, "Don't orcs eat and don't they drink? Or do they just live on foul air and poison?" And Frodo says in response, "No, they eat and drink, Sam. The shadow that bred them can only mock. It cannot make. Not real new things of its own. I don't think it gave life to the orcs. It only ruined them and twisted them. And if they are to live at all, they have to live like other living creatures." So men of the West, shield maidens and shire folk, stand together and protect the things that are good, beautiful, and true, and always have hope. As long as we're willing to create and fight the darkness, that means we win. So thank you again, and I hope to see all of you on January 29th. Now, go forth and create. Have a great day.